My name is Professor Russell, an ethnobotanist at Stanford University. For the past 2 decades, I've been studying North American mystical plants, their strange powers, and how ancient tribes may have used them to enter otherworldly realms. I've traveled deep into forests, ventured to forgotten groves, and spent countless hours in the field, risking exposure to plants that could twist the mind and heart. But until recently, I thought I'd seen it all. I thought I knew what to expect from a plant-based ceremony. I was wrong. I'd been invited to a private ayahuasca ceremony by a colleague of mine, Dr. Elliot Crane. It was supposedly a small gathering of researchers and open-minded individuals eager to explore the boundaries of consciousness. Though ayahuasca was not my main area of expertise, I knew its reputation as a tool for transcending the self. And after years of research and observation, I decided it was time to step into that world firsthand. But what I encountered was nothing I could have prepared for. The ceremony was held in an isolated cabin up in the Northern California woods. It was secluded, away from civilization, as these things usually are. When I arrived, the place looked ancient. Moss-covered walls, dim lighting, smoke hanging heavy in the air from bundles of sage and Palo Santo smudges. The group was gathered together, shadowed by the flickering light. Some looked nervous, others calm, even eager. Dr. Crane moved around the room, lighting candles and murmuring in a low, rhythmic tone that seemed almost rehearsed, as if he'd done this 100 times before. After a while, Dr. Crane gathered us around a large wooden bowl. "Tonight's blend is different," he began, his voice carrying a tone of quiet reverence. "We're exploring ancient paths, using plants from forgotten traditions. The brew contains ayahuasca, yes, but also something rare, something sacred that will guide you. As an ethnobotanist, I'm well versed in the usual plants mixed with ayahuasca, Banisteriopsis kaapi, Psychotria viridis, and other admixtures common to the Amazon. But something about his tone unsettled me. I watched him closely as he distributed a small yellowish powder to each participant. This wasn't the usual tea, steeped and bitter. This was something else entirely. "Tonight," he said, "you'll also be taking Damiana. It's an ancient herb used for mystical purposes." Damiana. I knew it well. Turnera diffusa. Traditionally, it's used in small doses as an aphrodisiac, a relaxant, nothing that would normally be paired with something as intense as ayahuasca. But something about his choice felt wrong. Mixing these two plants in this way didn't align with any ritual I'd ever come across. The others, oblivious to the specifics, took their portions eagerly. I hesitated for a second, feeling my professional caution rise, but in that dim, smoky room, curiosity won out. We ingested the mixture, each participant drifting into their own space around the room. The low, droning hum of Dr. Crane's voice continued, guiding us deeper until the darkness closed in completely. At first, everything seemed normal. The gentle waves of nausea, the distant thumping of my heartbeat, the familiar rush as the plant medicine took hold. But then something began to shift. The air thickened. The walls seemed to grow darker, the candles burning lower than they should. I glanced around the room, feeling my pulse spike as I noticed the others. Their faces were slack, eyes half open but staring blankly. One man, sitting cross-legged by the wall, had his mouth twisted in a silent scream, his eyes wide with terror. Another woman was shaking violently, her mouth moving as if in prayer. And then the smell hit me. Sour, metallic, like the sharp sting of blood. My stomach turned as I realized what it was. They were dying. One by one, they began to collapse, their bodies going limp, heads lolling to the side like dolls dropped to the floor. Some clawed at their own skin, others clutched their chests, gasping for air, eyes bulging. I could hear Dr. Crane whispering something, his voice low and frantic, but he didn't move to help anyone. He just stood there watching, his hands clenched into fists. I tried to stand, but my legs felt heavy, as if weights had been tied to my ankles. A wave of nausea washed over me as my vision started to blur. My chest felt tight, my heartbeat pounding erratically. In my haze, I realized that this was no ordinary Damiana. The plant's effects had been altered, twisted. Somehow Dr. Crane had done something to it, transformed it into a poison. "Why?" I managed to croak, forcing myself to look up at him. His face was unreadable, eyes dark and unfocused as he stared at us, almost like he was watching an experiment unfold. "Sometimes," he said softly, "we have to be willing to go beyond, to sacrifice, for the knowledge we seek. You, of all people, should understand that, Russell." The room began to spin, the shadows swallowing the remaining light as my vision tunneled. I could barely make out the shapes around me. My fellow participants sprawled on the floor, their bodies contorted in impossible angles, expressions frozen in agony. And through it all, Dr. Crane remained still, his eyes fixed on us, a faint smile twisting his lips as if he were pleased, as if this was exactly what he had wanted. I don't remember much after that, only fragments, a burning sensation in my veins, my fingers digging into the floor, trying to crawl away. The smell of death was thick, almost tangible, clinging to the walls, seeping into my skin. And then, darkness. I woke up hours later, alone in that cabin. The bodies were gone, the floor scrubbed clean. There was no trace of anyone else, no signs of Dr. Crane or the others, as if they had never been there at all. My car keys were on the table, a small note beside them in Crane's handwriting. "Knowledge has a price, Russell. Consider it paid." I returned to Stanford the next day, shaken and haunted. No one believes me, of course. Dr. Crane's office is empty. His email, his phone, everything erased. As far as the university is concerned, he never existed. But I know the truth. He's out there, somewhere, still searching, still pushing boundaries that shouldn't be crossed. And I can't shake the feeling that he's watching me, waiting, as if I still owe him something, some twisted debt that I'll never understand.
I'm not sure if writing this will bring me any comfort or if it's just another way to stop myself from unraveling. They told me to take some time off, process what happened. But how do you process a nightmare that you survived only by sheer luck? I'm a professor of botany at the University of Washington. I was known for my level-headedness, for my reliance on empirical data, for my skepticism of anything that smelled faintly of mysticism. That's who I was. I'm not so sure now, because out in the Amazon, I saw something that defied every scientific principle I hold dear. There were 5 of us on the expedition. Dr. Clayton, Dr. Morales, and Dr. Kim were among the best in their fields. Then there was our guide, Raoul, who had grown up in these jungles and was about as seasoned as they come. He could tell the difference between poisonous plants and safe ones by scent alone. And me, the team lead, a man who believed that every question about nature could be answered under a microscope. Our mission was straightforward: collect samples, document possible new species, report findings. This was supposed to be a career-defining trip for me, maybe even put my name on the cover of a few journals. We were prepared for encounters with dangerous animals, disease-carrying insects, and unpredictable weather, but no amount of preparation could have shielded us from what we found. It started on the 4th day. We were trekking through a dense, humid part of the jungle, not far from the Rio Negro. I remember the air was thick, suffocating. Raoul had told us to tread carefully, that this part of the forest was forgotten land. I'd shrugged it off as superstition. We were scientists, not children in a ghost story. That's when Dr. Clayton spotted it, a plant, brilliant green, almost glowing in the underbrush. Its leaves looked like they were dusted with something iridescent, shimmering like oil in the sunlight. It was beautiful, captivating in a way that almost felt unnatural, if that makes sense. There was something alluring about it. Clayton, without hesitation, reached down and ran his fingers along one of the leaves, laughing that we'd found our big discovery. "Can you imagine the papers we'll write on this?" he said, and in that instant, something shifted. His laugh died on his lips, his eyes unfocused, staring at the plant as if he were hypnotized. None of us noticed the thin, hair-like filaments that had wrapped around his fingers. He suddenly went rigid, his mouth parting slightly as if he wanted to speak but couldn't. I could see his muscles straining, twitching. He fell to his knees, staring straight ahead with a hollow gaze that made my skin crawl. "Clayton?" I whispered, but he didn't respond. He reached into his pack, slowly, methodically, pulling out a machete we'd used to cut through thick vines. With a blank stare, he swung the machete up, slicing it into his own arm without a flicker of pain on his face. Blood splattered onto the forest floor, and he kept going, hacking away at his own flesh, with a smile stretched grotesquely across his face. We were paralyzed, horrified. But that was only the beginning. Dr. Morales and Dr. Kim screamed, lunging forward to help him. But as soon as they got close, something shifted in their expressions too. They stopped abruptly, standing still as statues, staring at the plant just as Clayton had. I saw those same hair-like filaments stretching out, touching their skin. I wanted to yell, to warn them, but I couldn't find my voice. I was too terrified, too rooted to the ground. Raoul grabbed my arm, pulling me back. "Professor, we have to go," he whispered, his voice trembling, but I couldn't leave them. I was responsible for them. They were my team. But then Dr. Kim turned, her face slack, her eyes blank, and drove a knife into Dr. Morales' throat over and over as he gurgled and clawed at her arms, trying to pull her away. Blood was everywhere, soaking into the soil, staining that cursed plant. I still see it when I close my eyes, how the plant seemed to absorb it, its leaves glowing a deeper green as if it were feeding. Raoul yanked me backward, snapping me out of my paralysis. "They're gone," he said, barely a whisper. "It has them now." We ran blindly, crashing through the underbrush, not stopping until we were miles away. Even then, every shadow, every movement made me jump. We could still hear the faint, chilling sounds of the team, or what was left of them. The plants had taken control, and it seemed to be orchestrating them, like puppets. The jungle was filled with distant screams and horrifying laughter that sounded almost joyous. Raoul and I stumbled upon a small clearing and collapsed, struggling to catch our breath. "The stories were true," he muttered. I turned to him, confused. "What stories?" Raoul's face was pale. "The elders. They talk of plants that crave more than sunlight, plants that feed on the minds of men. They say these plants were forgotten by time, buried in places humans were meant to leave alone." I wanted to argue, to tell him that was nonsense. But after what I'd just seen, how could I? Every scientific principle I'd ever believed in crumbled around me. We waited, listening to the eerie silence. And in that quiet, I realized something even more horrifying. The plants weren't just taking control. They were enjoying it. This wasn't mere survival or self-defense. It was malevolent, predatory, aware. The plant had manipulated my team, turned them against each other like a game. It fed off our terror, our pain. I could feel it in the air, as if the entire jungle was watching, waiting for its next meal. Somehow, Raoul and I made it out of that hellish forest. When we found civilization, we didn't talk about what we'd seen, and the authorities chalked it up to a case of jungle madness or a group hallucination from exposure to some unknown toxin. But I know the truth. I can still hear them at night, my team, the way they laughed and screamed, the way the plant fed off their despair. I know that it's still out there, somewhere in that forgotten part of the Amazon, waiting. And I know that no one will believe me if I try to warn them. After all, I'm just a man whose eyes play tricks on him, a man haunted by his own mind. But I can't stop thinking, what if I'd touched it too?